Well, we've been thrilled, haven't we, with the first two talks in seeing the great movement of God amongst the nations. After 43 years, Britain is now moving out of Europe, and Sheba and Dedan, the Saudi Arabian Peninsula, talking to Israel, sharing military secrets. Who would have thought that would have happened 20 years ago? But there it is, in the purpose and hand of God. And now we come this evening to another incredible sign, and it's the development of the King of the North. And this sign, brothers and sisters, is an amazing sign because we as a brotherhood have been waiting nearly 100 years for this to develop. And we see this evening how that will in fact transpire. The amazing thing about this whole arrangement is that my PowerPoint's not going to work. When the Berlin Wall fell, there was great disquiet amongst the Brotherhood that Russia had fallen from grace, its power was no longer apparent on the world stage, but now we're getting headlines like this. How Putin made Russia's military into a modern, lethal fighting force. Now, that's an incredible statement when you think about it. The article went on to say that the Russian military is now better equipped and more capable of conducting modern combat operations than at any point since the fall of the Soviet Union, which has caught analysts in the West by surprise. And this always seems to be the way with Russia, catching the West by surprise. You may recall that last year they launched a number of cruise missiles from the Caspian Sea, caught the West by surprise. Russia is in Syria, caught the West by surprise. And that's the way Russia is. And let me tell you, brothers and sisters, that if this man is not the Gog, the next man will be frightening indeed. Because this man has such a grip on power that he has single-handedly moved the Russian economy and the Russian military into the forefront of the nation's psyche. Whilst we're talking about the development of Russia in Syria, we need to be aware that Russia is opening up another front in Europe. And as we speak, in the last week or so, the Russians are building their forces on the Ukrainian border. What happened was that some Ukrainians crossed into Crimea, which is of course now held by Russia, and began a number of intelligence exercises in an attempt to try and overthrow some of the forces in Crimea. And when Putin heard that, the newspaper says he was furious. So much so that in actual fact, this military escalation by Russia in Crimea against Ukraine brings this kind of reaction to the world. Preparations for conventional conflict between Russia and Ukraine are accelerating, and the likelihood of open war is increasing rapidly. Now, whether or not this happens, we'll have to wait and see. Putin is a master of strategy. He'll put pressure on a country, withdraw the pressure. Put pressure back again, withdraw the pressure. He's the one that will send fighter planes to buzz US warships in the Baltic area. He's the one that will pull back and then go forward and pull back. This may just be an exercise, but this is the reaction of the press at the moment. They are worried that the increasing demands of Russian security in the region of eastern Ukraine, which is mostly a Russian population area, is now coming to the stage of acceleration. So whilst Russia's in Syria, this other front's now opening up in the west here in the Ukraine. Article here on US military strength, preempting further Russian aggression against Europe. Acceptance of Russia's aggression in Europe will only invite more. And that's the issue the West is facing. If Obama wants to counter Russian aggression, it sends 150 Marines into Poland. That's not going to stop 20,000 Russian troops. And this acquiescence by America, this very, very muted response, is only encouraging Russia to make more threatening demands across the borders in Europe. The occupation and illegal annexation of Crimea and the subsequent war in eastern Ukraine indicate that Russia is both able and willing to use military force against neighbouring nations. This should not come as a surprise considering Russia's invasion of Georgia in 2008. So the trend is continuing. The aggression, movement of troops is all not just posturing, but as this particular article said, there's a willingness and ability by Russia to use force to do this. Well, that's in the western part of the world, and we'll wait with interest as to see what happens. Will the pressure go on? Will the Ukrainians cave in? You see, the fact with Ukraine is this, that they're not part of NATO, so you see it's fair game as far as Russia's concerned. He's not touching a NATO country. Let's move across to our subject more this evening. You know, this is an interesting picture, isn't it? You don't see many people kissing Vladimir Putin. But she's a Syrian, actually. She's from Damascus, and that's a poster of Vladimir Putin. And what it demonstrates is that in the eyes of the Assad government, in the eyes of the current government in Damascus, which Russia supports, there is a huge relief that Russia is now stepping in to sort out the mess in Syria, the civil war in Syria. You may recall that 4 or 5 years ago there was the Arab Spring, and the Arab Spring has sputtered. And when it got to Damascus, it divided the country, and half the country in the north wanted to take control of the government, and Bashar al-Assad said, no way in the world will you come into Damascus, and civil war eventuated. That was going on for 2-3 years with tremendous loss of life. And now Russia stepped in, and you get photographs like this of this woman from Damascus kissing the portrait of Vladimir Putin, the saviour of Damascus. Quite a significant thing that we're seeing in this particular situation. Let's come to Daniel chapter 8, which was read this evening, because we're going to draw the background to this expression, the King of the North, and we're going to explain the way Daniel used it, the way the Bible uses it, to talk about this conflict that's emerging in the Middle East itself. Now, as Brother Brian mentioned, the roots of all of this conflict begin in Daniel chapter 8. And in verse 5, we read there, as I was considering, behold, an he-goat came from the west on the face of the whole earth, touched not the ground, and the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. And Daniel, in fact, provides the interpretation in verse 21. That goat with the notable horn is the Grecian power under Alexander the Great, and it was a notable horn. It took the world by storm. The record then says, in verse 7, that the conflict was so fierce, feet never touched the ground, and the record says in verse 7 that I saw him come close to the ram and he was moved with choler against him. That's an unusual word in our authorized version. The Hebrew word means bitterness. It in fact describes the motive by which the Greeks attacked the vast expanse of the Medo-Persian Empire. You see, Xerxes, who was one of the early Persian kings, invaded Greece and caused so much damage to Athens and to the Grecian peninsula. The Greeks never ever forgot that. So when Alexander the Great launched his attack against the Persian Empire, it was with great bitterness, and he relentlessly pursued Darius across the plains of Turkey and eventually Iran till he hunted him down. And there's no power in the ram to stop that. So the vast crash of the goat against the ram, heard across the world. None could deliver the ram out of his hand. Dramatic, as Alexander the Great swept all the way across the then known world. The rough goat, the king of Greece, and there's a very famous mosaic some 200 years after the battle of Isis and Arbela, in which Alexander is noted there, and the dominance of those eyes, and the dominance of that expression, and the focus of the battle, that is the man who is the notable horn, the first king. But in verse 22, we know the story. Never seen a ram with 4 horns, but I did find a photograph of one, and this is a mutation. It's something out of the ordinary. And that's the description of the succession of Alexander's empire. The horn was broken, removed. Alexander died in Babylon in the age of 33, in absolute contrast to the Lord Jesus Christ. And from that, this whole massive empire disintegrated. Now the record says there in verse 22, at the end of that verse, that 4 kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation, but not in his power. That is, not as a successor of Alexander. None of Alexander's children ever received any inheritance in that kingdom. It went to the generals. Verse 9, with a little bit more detail about this breaking up of Alexander's empire, because you see, not only was it divided into four, but a fifth power arrived on the horizon. And this fifth power, in verse 9, it is said, in fact, to wax exceeding great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the pleasant land. One of the wonderful things about Brother Thomas's exposition of Daniel and the Apocalypse is that it's a very rigorous, logical explanation of the chapters of Daniel and the chapters of the Apocalypse. See, when you come across a verse like this, and you come across church commentaries, you'll find that in 97% of all church commentaries get this verse wrong. And it leads them down a path in which there is no real solution at all. But the doctor, through his careful reading of the Bible, was able to explain this verse and this chapter very wonderfully, as we shall see a little bit later on in the course of our address. You see, the churches say that this development of this fifth power was really Antiochus Epiphanes, who was another Seleucid king. And all of these verses in Daniel chapter 8 have no relationship to anything future. It all is found within Antiochus Epiphanes. And Brother Thomas saw the error of that. Show the error of that as well. But this fifth power emerges, and the record says that it comes from the west. Well, that's not actually mentioned, is it? That's already assumed. Geographically, the Roman power absorbed all of these Greek powers, but prophetically, it is linked with the Syrian horn. You see, it must have already come from the north because it goes south, and it must have already come from the west because it goes east. And the reason why, prophetically, the Roman power, this fifth power on the horizon, which we shall see in a moment, comes out of the Syrian horn is because it's got to link with the brass and the iron of the bands of the tree of Daniel. It has to be linked to the Seleucid horn. Now, I'm going ahead a little bit more on that, but it's interesting that the doctor saw all of this. That this fifth power that arrived on the horizon was in fact not Antiochus Epiphanes, it was Rome. Now let's just have a look a bit closer at this. This power in verses 10 to 12, let's read that, shall we? It waxed great, even the margin is correct, it's against the host of heaven. It cast down some of the host and the stars of the ground and stamped upon them. Yea, he magnified himself against the prince of the host. And by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. Now, the church says Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus Epiphanes invaded the land of Israel. The prince there, the host, was the high priest, and he confronted the high priest, and he, in fact, destroyed some of the temple. Well, he actually didn't do all of that. But actually, it's all wrong. See, because the prince of the host is Jesus Christ himself. And the sanctuary that was cast down was the destruction of the temple by the Romans in AD 70. Now that expression, cast down, just keep your hand in there, come across to Matthew 24. Now this is how accurately our Lord read his Bible. See, because in Matthew 24, that's exactly the language that's used. We know the story, don't we, that the disciples looked across the temple in Matthew 24, and they deliberately showed the Lord all of this magnificent building, and it was a magnificent building. It's one of the wonders of the ancient world, Herod's temple. But verse 2, Jesus said to them, "See ye not all these things?" Matthew 24, verse 2, "Truly I say to you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be cast down." Thrown down. That's the language of Daniel chapter 8 and verse 11. You see, the Lord knew that was speaking about Rome. It was a prediction about the destruction of the Jewish people and the destruction of the temple, and every stone will be cast down. You see, the Lord knew that. Now, let's come across, shall we, to the fulfillment of this. What is intriguing about this incident is that when Alexander the Great died, there were five generals who were competing for his empire. He only had one son, and that child was murdered in infancy. Now, this is interesting because, you see, the record says we need four. So if you were a Bible student after Alexander's death, you'd be scratching your head thinking, well, how's this going to work? Because there are five generals. That one there in the brown, Antigonus, was the fifth general that sought to lay claim to Alexander's empire. But you see, what happened was that in 301 there was a huge battle, the Battle of Ipsos, and that fifth general was removed. So we're talking just a few years after Alexander's death, that at last the prophecy was absolutely right. And the four generals themselves took control of that empire. Cassander, Lysimachus, Ptolemy, and Seleucus. The area in yellow is the area of Ptolemies. The area in blue is the area of Seleucids. And these are the main players in the book of Daniel. Why are they important? Because, as Brother Brian pointed out, Israel is the meat in the sandwich. Israel is the power that's going to get hit from the north and from the south every single time. And that's why they play a significant role. Now, in Daniel chapter 11, most of the chapter deals with this conflict between the Seleucids here and the Ptolemies in the south. In fact, there were a series of wars, backwards and forwards. And Israel, in the end, received all of that conflict because it was in the middle of that. And Daniel 11, in great detail, describes that. Now, do you know that the detail is so significant that skeptics of the Bible have tried to prove that it was written after the event? It's just so detailed. Of all of this movement between north and south, a fascinating chapter. Now, let's come to verse 23, because this is where we come to the crux of the issue that takes us from the past into the future. And what verse 23 does is explains how this fifth power, this horn arising out of one of the four horns, is now going to dominate the Middle East. Let's read verse 23. In the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors are come to the full, a king of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentences shall stand up. And his power shall be mighty, but not by his own power, and he shall destroy wonderfully and shall prosper in practice, and shall destroy the mighty and the holy people. So you see, verse 23 and 24 is a commentary on verses 10, 11 and 12. It's an explanation as to how this power, in fact, grew and overthrew the Jewish people. Now let's look at the language. This phrase is critical. In the latter time of their kingdom. So these four generals, Lysimachus, Cassander, Ptolemy and Seleucid, they're going to exist for a time. But at the end of their kingdom, at the time when their kingdom is about to be dissolved and removed, in the latter time of their kingdom, in other words, from around BC 190 to about BC 30, this fifth power is going to come into the arena of the Middle East. When the transgressors come to a full, in actual fact, the Hebrew is when the transgressions are come to a full. And the Lord Jesus Christ, in Matthew 23, verse 32, picked that idea up. He said about the Jewish nation, about their iniquity coming to a full. Let's look at that, shall we? Matthew 23. Talking about the iniquity of the nation, the evil of the nation. In verse 32, he said, "Fill ye up the measure of your fathers." Fill ye up. When the transgressions are come to the full. You see that the Lord knew the prophecy of Daniel chapter 8. So, in the latter time of their kingdoms, so when these four Greek divisions are going to now crumble beneath the might of Rome, and when the transgressions are going to come to a full, when the Jewish people's iniquity is about to be topped up to the full, A king of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentences shall stand up. Now I want you to come to Deuteronomy 28, because that expression is drawn from Deuteronomy 28. Deuteronomy 28, we read this. Verse 48, therefore thou shalt serve thine enemies, which Yahweh thy God shall send against thee, in hunger and in thirst, in nakedness, in want of all things. He shall put a yoke of iron upon thy neck until he have destroyed thee. Now we know that Deuteronomy 28, verse 48, is talking about the Roman power. A yoke of iron until he has destroyed thee. Those are frightening words. Rome would be in Israel until Israel was destroyed. That's why Daniel 8 spoke about the fall of the Jewish Commonwealth, because it's been out. Look at the language of verse 49. Yahweh shall bring a nation against thee from far, from the ends of the earth, as swift as the eagle flieth, a nation whose language thou shalt not understand, a nation of fierce countenance. Now, if you have a marginal reference, you'll see there the Hebrew is strong of face, and it includes Daniel 8, verse 23 in the list of quotations. So the expression king of fierce countenance, in referring to the Roman power, was not an isolated incident. It was drawing from Deuteronomy 28. The power of Rome is evident. Let's come back to Daniel chapter 8. This is the emergence of Rome into the Middle East. And the authorized version says he will understand dark sentences, or as Rotham says, skillful in dissimulation. And it's this quality of dissimulation moved through the path of history into the Kremlin. This skill in dissimulation, as Ezekiel 38 says, will be the basis by which it invades. An evil thought shall come into thy mind. Land's at peace, now I'll take advantage of that. And it all comes back to this trickery of the way in which Rome, as a world power, began to treat all of those people. Now, verse 24 talks about the destruction of the Jewish state at the hands of Rome. He shall destroy the mighty and holy people. And precisely what he did. Now, in verse 25, we come to the future. And this is why none of this can refer to Antiochus Epiphanes. It refers to Rome. Read this verse carefully. And through his policy, this is the policy of Rome, through his policy also he shall cause craft to prosper in his hand. Now that word craft is a word used in Jeremiah chapter 9. Let's come across this, shall we? Jeremiah chapter 9. Talking about the deceit of those who deceive by religion. So here it is in Jeremiah 9 verse 6, talking about those in verse 5 who deceive every man his neighbour. So verse 6, thine habitation, that's Israel's, is in the midst of deceit. Through deceit they refuse to know me, saith Yahweh. So this idea of craft really is the idea of deceitfulness. He shall cause deceit, this religious deceit, to prosper in his hand. And the Romans did that. The Romans eventually, by supporting the papacy, by sponsoring priestcraft, caused this deceit to prosper. Verse 25 says, he shall magnify himself in his heart, so he's arrogant, by peace shall destroy many. And here is the critical part of the verse. He shall also stand up and be broken without hand. Now, where's that language from? He shall stand up and be broken without hand. That's Daniel 2, verse 34. Now, who's he standing up against? Verse 25 says, the Prince of Princes, the Commander of the Commanders. That's Jesus Christ. So we have moved from Rome in verse 24 to a future power in verse 25 that will take control of the ancient Roman Empire, will stand up against Jesus Christ, will support priestcraft, and through his arrogance shall be broken without hand. Daniel 2, verse 34. So you can see how amazing this prophecy is. We have moved from the conflict of the Middle East back in the area just before Rome came on the scene to the future in a verse. Now, whoever takes control of the ancient Roman Empire will be Gog. And if it's Putin, he is precisely the man who is causing craft to prosper. You've probably seen the photographs of Putin and the Russian Orthodox Patriarch hand in hand, supporting each other. Putin knows he needs the Russian Orthodox Church. The Patriarch knows he needs Russia to allow him to exist upon the scene, and together, supporting each other, this man is exactly what this arrangement is, causing deceit, priestcraft to prosper. Eventually, Putin will support the papacy, and the strength of the iron will come into the equation. But there it is in a verse. Through policy, he'll cause priestcraft to prosper, he'll magnify himself, by peace he will destroy many. Art thou come to take a spoil? And in the end, he will stand against the commander of commanders and be destroyed without hand. So therefore, this power, this fifth power that we've talked about, is a significant power in the book of Daniel. Now let's just move on. So historically, what happened? Well, those four Greek parts, Lysimachus, Cassander, Ptolemy and Seleucid, eventually, in growing powerful in this particular region, failed to really understand the threat that Rome presented. And Rome slowly encroached on the Greek territory from the west. You can see there the map on red. That's the area where Rome is now coming into Greece. It actually came in through the Pergamum area, historically. But prophetically, it's linked with the Seleucid horn. Now, whilst that's happening on the west, the Persians are nibbling away on the east. So you can see that the Seleucid Empire that was once right across that ancient territory is now being nibbled both east and west. Until finally, Rome took the lot. Took Egypt in BC 30, took Syria in BC 63, took Judea in BC 65. Now the interesting thing about this, for a very brief historical moment, Rome, Babylon, only for about 20, 30 years. But it was enough just to link Babylon with Rome. Just 20, 30 years, that's all it took. And then the empire shrunk back a little bit. But in the providence of God, it needed just to make that link. You see, the bands of brass and iron, which banded the Babylonian tree, needed to have that connection with Babylon. And under Hadrian, the empire went out, touched Babylon very briefly, and then shrank back. So there was the connection being made prophetically. But you can see now from that map that the king of the north and the king of the south have disappeared. That they are no longer entities. Okay? No longer do they exist. They've been absorbed by the Roman power. And as time progressed, they continue to be absorbed. The Turks came in, the Roman Empire divided, still absorbed. The Turks, Ottomans came in, they were still absorbed. They weren't independent powers. Let's come to Daniel chapter 11, because Daniel chapter 11 is an expansion of Daniel 8. And if you recognise that, it makes so much more sense, and it's easy to grasp. Daniel 11 is the expansion of Daniel 8. So when we come to verse 36 of Daniel 11, we really have an explanation of this king of fierce countenance. We have this further development of this fifth power, this Roman power. Okay, let's read verse 36, shall we, of Daniel 11. And the king shall do according to his will, and he shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvellous things against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished. Now, I've got here 3 points of connection, which we need to understand to make the links between Daniel 11 and Daniel chapter 8. The first thing is this. In Daniel 11, this power is called the king. That's clearly a reference to the king of fierce countenance in Daniel chapter 8. Secondly, Daniel chapter 11. Sorry, that verse there shouldn't be 26. It should be 36. My apologies. Daniel 11:36. He shall magnify himself above every god. That's exactly what Daniel 8 had. He shall magnify himself in his heart. And here is the other critical connection. This king in Daniel 11 verse 36 will prosper until he is destroyed in the indignation. So whoever this power is, this king in Daniel 11 verse 36 will exist until he's destroyed by Jesus Christ. And that's why it's important to understand that context. That's exactly what Daniel 8 was saying, that power which by deceit and craft will exist until he's destroyed by the Prince of Princes. It's exactly the same point being made. These two powers are exactly the same power. Daniel 11 verse 36, there's a little bit more detail about how this king is going to support priestcraft. He shall honour a God of guardians. He shall honour Catholic saints. Now, in Daniel 11 verse 40, read, at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind. Now we have to understand that there's a subtlety in this verse. And the subtlety is this. There are not just two powers in that verse, there are three. There is the king of the north, which is the old Seleucid territory. There's the king of the south, the old Ptolemy territory. And there's a power called him. There's three powers in that verse. Here's the drama of the verse before we explain it in detail. The king of the north and the king of the south disappeared from history when the Romans took that area. Absorbed by the Roman Empire, they disappeared as entities. There was no longer an independent foreign power in Seleucia and an independent foreign power in Egypt. It was absorbed in one huge colossal power. That continued for nearly 2,000 years, and then in 1882, the area of Egypt got its independence very briefly, and the Ottoman power lost control of Egypt, and Egypt for a very brief time was independent until a foreign power occupied Egypt, and that foreign power was Britain. That time, in 1882, when Britain went into Egypt, the king of the south began to emerge in the drama of history for the first time in 2,000 years. But the Seleucid Empire, the king of the north area, was still part of the Ottoman Empire. The drama of Daniel 11 verse 40 is that after 2,000 years of absence, in the time of the end, these two powers suddenly reappear. That's the drama of the verse. Think about that. They've disappeared for 2,000 years, and at the time of the end, they reappear on the stage. But they reappear in the context of the king of fierce countenance, the king of verse 36. And that king is the him of the verse. Now, you've got to get your head around that. So, time of the end, king of the south, a foreign power in occupation of Egypt, will push at him. Him is this king in control of the Byzantium part of the Roman Empire. It is the Turkish power. And that's why when the king of the south pushed at him, it was pushing at the Turkish power, the king of fierce countenance. In 1917, as Brother Brian mentioned, we have this push, and it was a battle that just did that, pushed. It was a battle, but it was a confining push. It wasn't a total decimation of the Ottoman Empire. It just confined them a little bit further north. It's the drying up of the Euphrates in Revelation 16. The Australians were involved in that. It was the final cavalry charge in history. The Australian Light Horse Brigade helped take Beersheba. General Allenby went into Jerusalem and realised that he was entering a holy city and dismounted from his horse and walked into that city, knowing that he was unworthy to take that city. There's a sense of history with these people. But biblically, that was the king of the south pushing at him. Right up the Euphrates a bit more to allow the whole realignment of the Middle East to the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and Israel came back under the Balfour Declaration. Now, the next part of the verse says this: King of the north shall come against him. So if the British pushed him, the Turkish power, then the king of the north coming against him is the Russian invasion of Turkey. That's where we get it from. Okay? Now the point is this, is that we as a brotherhood have been waiting nearly 100 development of the king of the north. 1917, the king of the south pushed at him, but there was still no king of the north. Last year, we saw the beginnings of the king of the north. Now let's just review this. This area in blue is the Seleucid Empire. This is the king of the north territory. And I want you to notice that part of that king of the north territory goes into Turkey, but it really includes Syria, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan and Pakistan. And Turkmenistan as well. So that's the area, the geographical area of the king of the north. And we therefore expect a power to emerge in that region which will eventually invade Turkey. And that's why we have been very excited to see the Russian influence, Turkmenistan, Iran and Syria. Because we are seeing the emerging of the ancient Seleucid Empire. We are seeing Russia, Gog, move into the King of the North area to establish this title as the King of the North. Astounding thing. We've been waiting years and years and years for this development to happen, and last year it happened. It's almost God putting hooks into the jaws of Russia and bringing them into this region. How did Russia get into Syria? I mean, it just happened. And that's the marvel of this movement. It just caught everyone by surprise. 1 minute they're not there, next minute they are there. So what happened? Well, Syrian President Bashar al-Assad had an army there, and he was fighting for his life. Civil war broke out. And that was exacerbated by the emergence of the Islamic State, IS. I believe that the Islamic State providentially were part of the hook that brought Russia into this region. It won't be the hook that brings Russia into the Middle East to take Israel, but it's an example, isn't it, of the way God drags nations into these positions. And I think ISIS is part of that arrangement. Well, this fierce conflict is continuing in Syria. It's an awful conflict. Thousands and thousands being displaced. You only have to see the photographs of the refugee camps. There's almost 2 million in Jordan. Another 1 million on the Turkish border. You can hardly imagine that. 3 million people displaced, living in tents. Enormous devastation. And of course, during all of this civil war, Russia is supplying military support to Assad, funding weapons into Syria and shoring up this particular dictator. The West, on the other hand, wants to get rid of Assad. This man is the man that gasses his own people. This is the butcher of Damascus. Well, in mid-2015, that's last year, Russia begins to construct new infrastructure at the Latakia Air Force Base in Syria, and the port in Tartus is upgraded to take larger ships. So weapons and advisors start arriving in Syria in great numbers. Build up here. These things don't just happen without a build-up of forces and intelligence and infrastructure. And Russia is expanding runways and building port infrastructure. There's something in the wind here. And then on the 30th of September 2015, on the pretext of fighting terrorism, Russia commences airstrikes against ISIS targets. And because the West is also fighting ISIS, there is little they can do to stop Russian expansion. Now they're caught flat-footed, because if I'm America and I'm bombing ISIS, and someone else comes in and helps me bomb ISIS, then, well, that should be commended. The trouble is it was Russia that came in to bomb ISIS, and America couldn't say anything. Well, we subsequently know that Russia didn't just bomb ISIS. Russia, in fact, started to bomb the rebels who were fighting against Bashar al-Assad. Recently, Aleppo, you've probably seen the photographs of Aleppo in Syria. Aleppo is a little microcosm of all of this complexity. You've got Kurds, rebels, Russians, Iranians, Hezbollah, Syrians, all focused on this little city, or this city called Aleppo. And Russia has no qualms at all about bombing hospitals or civilians. Awful situation. It's like the Assyrian of old, aggressive, powerful, almost Nazi-like in their advances. Don't care about civilian casualties. This is the Russia in Syria. So, we get articles like this. Russia's permanent military base in Syria. Moscow just tipped the balance of power in the Mediterranean. Though there has been remarkable little discussion on the subject of Western media, Russia last week quietly acquired, for the first time in its modern history, a proper permanent base in the Mediterranean. See, Tarshish was temporary. Latakia was temporary, but now they're starting to become permanent. Following negotiations between the Syrian government and Russia, an agreement dating to 2015 has now been ratified by Russia, turning the Russian air base at Khmenin in Syria into a permanent base. In other words, Russia will retain the base beyond the conclusion of the Syrian conflict, and its presence has just been made permanent. It is there to stay. A few months ago, they said they were withdrawing. It's just a smokescreen. You see, he's deceitful. He's skillful into simulation, says Daniel chapter 8. They're there to stay. Why? Because the biblical prophecy of Daniel says they must be in the territory of the king of the north. They must be in that region of Syria, Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan. And there have been successes against ISIS. And there's a map there showing the complex spaghetti of Syria. There you'll find that in red there, Islamic State losses in 2016. In the darker red, Islamic State territory loss in 2015. So you see, the northern part of ISIS is in fact decreasing. Russia's making headway. When Palmyra was taken in Syria, the Russians were very quick to say, we helped. Russia's winning. Russia's seen as a reliable ally. America's not really winning much, but Russia is. And that, to the Syrian people, is certainly worth taking note of. Get the job done. Now, this is what I meant when I said I think that ISIS is providentially one of the hooks that's brought Russia into this region. See, ISIS is a Sunni extreme reaction. Normally we've been used to Shiites bombing and carrying out atrocities, but this is the other extreme, Sunnis. And these Sunnis have, in fact, a global terror campaign. It's Brussels, it's Nice, it's places like that. That's why a worldwide solution has brought Russia into this, not just to shore up Bashar al-Assad, but to be an excuse to come into the region and deal with ISIS. ISIS may continue to be there until Armageddon. We don't know, but it's been the hook that's brought Russia into that particular area. Who can sort that complexity out? The other significant thing is that there have been some game changers as far as military hardware is concerned. Ezekiel 38:7 says that Russia will be a guard. And this whole concept of missile defense systems is this guard that Russia provides. It's got missile systems in Europe. It's got now missile systems here in the Middle East. Now look at the range of that missile. Who's going to challenge any aeroplane of Russia in that area there? And I want you to notice too that it also creeps across half of Israel. And that's disturbing the Israelis because they've had free rein up until now in going in and just taking out a few Hezbollah or Syrian weapons threats. But now, of course, Russia's in there and there's a problem. That's why Netanyahu and Putin meet regularly to actually sort out the rules of engagement. And Putin has said, not so much in many words, but has said to Netanyahu, look, on certain occasions you can go across the border and hit Hezbollah. Just let me know first. And that's a deal that the Russians and the Israelis have made. It's sort of sort of an uneasy truce in some ways. But that's the threat that Russia poses to Israel. It has put an umbrella of its S-400 missiles within range of Israel. And that's dangerous indeed. So Israel no longer has the flexibility it had several years ago. be thou a guard to them. He shall cause craft to prosper. There is a Christian zeal behind Russia's war in Syria. Here's an Orthodox priest blessing assault rifles and handing them out to Russian armed guards. You see, Putin is seen to be the hero and champion and saviour of the Christians in the Middle East. There aren't very many of them. Putin is seen to be the saviour of that. So here's a Russian Orthodox priest blessing a fighter plane just before it takes off. So he's got the holy water and he's sprinkling on the fuselage. You see, because that's the craft that's being sponsored by Putin himself. Many examples of this liaison with religion. Now, the other fascinating thing is this. Persia, in Ezekiel 38, belongs to the Russian Confederacy, and it's all part of that King of the North territory. So there have been these significant photographs. There's Putin all smiles with the Iranian leaders. Russia and Iran just got even closer. They have signed military deals exchanging intelligence. Russia and Iran have increased trade relations, especially over the past 5 years. They're involved in trade talks over nuclear technology, energy, arms sales, and have recently signed an intelligence agreement. So it's significantly binding these two together. Russia is part of the King of the North. Iran is in that territory, and the two are together. The latter will enable them to share intelligence, operate electronic and cyber warfare facilities on the Syrian-Lebanese border. This facility could gather intelligence on Israel and the United States. Any Iranian-Russian alliance must be given more consideration as it relates to the Middle and Near East and the world. So this particular commentator understood the power of these two nations getting together. The reason why this is significant is not only is it part of the territory of the King of the North, but you see, when Iran made that nuclear deal with America, what it did was unfreeze billions of dollars of Iranian assets in US banks. And now Iran is using that money to rearm and to reassert itself in the region. That's why it's in Ezekiel 38. Persia, Ethiopia and Libya. This alliance is significant. Now, in that cartoon, you have there a lot of truth expressed in that Iran's whole concept of becoming a dominant part of this region is to use Iraq to get to Syria. So you see, it's not just Iran bolstering its image and power in the region. It seeks to expand, and of course Russia will facilitate that. And Russia and Syria together will make sure that happens. At the moment, Iran's using Iraq as a bridge for greater things. In fact, at the moment, Iranian troops and Iraqi troops are fighting together. It's a most unusual and bizarre situation. And as Brother Greg alluded to this afternoon, Russia launches third day of Syria strikes from Iran. This photo, grabbed from the Russian Defense Ministry video footage, is said to show a long-range bomber releasing its payload above Syria after it took off from an airbase in Iran. Now, the significance of that is that Iran has never, ever allowed any foreign power ever in the history of the revolution of Iran to use its facilities, and now it's allowed Russia to use its facilities. There's more than just alignment here. There's a cooperation going on which allows the Iranians to break their own rules and allow Russia to come in. Now, this article here, The Price of Powerlessness, I'm going to just quote in full. It is a fascinating article. This particular opinion writer of the Washington Post, Charles Krauthammer, is quite famous for some of his astute views of the Middle East. Let's just read some of this. This week, Russian bombers flew out of Iranian air bases to attack rebel positions in Syria. The State Department pretended not to be surprised. It should be alarmed. Iran's intensely nationalistic revolutionary regime had never permitted foreign forces to operate from its soil. until now. The reordering of the Middle East is proceeding apace. Where for 40 years the US-Egypt alliance anchored the region, a Russia-Iran condominium is now dictating events. That's what you get after 8 years of US retrenchment and withdrawal. That's why it's called the price of powerlessness. That's what results in the nuclear deal with Iran, the evacuation of Iraq, and the utter US inability on Syria. So he's pulling no punches here. 8 years of Obama's rule has left a vacuum in this whole region that has allowed a Russia-Iranian force to be sucked in and dictate events. So he goes through the nation. Let's look at Iran first, he says. The nuclear deal was supposed to bring a rapprochement between Washington and Tehran. Instead, it has solidified a strategic military alliance between Moscow and Tehran. So what America was hoping to do by appeasing Iran and getting this deal, which Israel completely disagreed with, has now brought in something totally unexpected, a Moscow-Tehran alliance. With the lifting of sanctions and the normalizing of Iran's international relations, Russia rushed in with major deals, including the shipment of S-300 ground-to-air missiles. Russian use of Iranian bases now marks a new level of cooperation and joint power projection. It's frightening. This is what's driving the Saudi Arabians, Sheba and Dedan of Ezekiel 38, to talk to Israel's military intelligence. Because Iran and Russia in Iran is a massive threat to the security of the region. Let's take Iraq. These bombing runs cross Iraqi airspace. So Russia's taking off from Iran, goes over Iraq and drops the bombs on Syria. Before President Obama's withdrawal from Iraq, that could not have happened. I mean, Russia overflying Iraq, where America was there. The resulting vacuum has not only created a corridor for Russian bombing, it has gradually allowed a hard-won post-Saddam Iraq to slip into Iran's orbit. According to Baghdad-based US military spokesman, there are 100,000 Shiite militia fighters operating inside Iraq, 80% of them Iranian-backed. Now just think about that. America has spent the last 7 years, blood, sweat and tears, with body bags going back to America in trying to establish some kind of presence in Iraq. And all of that now is gone. All of that sweat, blood and tears, all that death and anguish has now suddenly been dissipated in a few months. And 80% of the Shiite fighters are Iranian-backed. Iran is virtually half controlling Iraq. Syria, where Russia dramatically intervened last year, establishing air bases and launching a savage bombing campaign, Obama did nothing. Indeed, he smugly predicted that Vladimir Putin had entered a quagmire. Some quagmire. Bashar al-Assad's regime is not only saved, it encircled Aleppo and has seized the upper hand in the civil war. Meanwhile, our hapless Secretary of State is running around trying to sue for peace, offering to share intelligence and legitimise Russian intervention if only Putin will promise to conquer gently. Now, you can picture the irony and the sarcasm in that. So you've got America tiptoeing around all of this whilst Russia is just taking control. And the enemy, Bashar al-Assad, has now been saved by Russia. Consider what Putin has achieved. Dealt a very weak hand, a rump Russian state, short of empire and saddled with a backward economy and a rusting military, he has restored Russia to great power status. Reduced to irrelevance in the 1990s, it is now a force to be reckoned with. In Europe, Putin has unilaterally redrawn the map. His annexation of Crimea will not be reversed. The Europeans are eager to throw off the few sanctions they grudgingly imposed on Russia, and the rape of eastern Ukraine continues. We've seen that in the build of those troops. 10,000 have already died, and now Putin is threatening even more open warfare. Under the absurd pretext of Ukrainian terrorism in Crimea, reminiscent of Hitler's claim that he invaded Poland in response to a Polish border incursion, Putin has threatened retaliation. Mass troops in 8 locations on the Ukrainian border, ordered Black Sea naval exercises, and moved advanced anti-aircraft batteries into Crimea, giving Moscow control over much of Ukrainian airspace. This is frightening stuff, brothers and sisters. Why shouldn't he? He's pushing on an open door. Obama still refused to send Ukraine even defensive weapons. The administration's response to these provocations? Urging both sides to exercise restraint. Both sides, mind you. Now, quoted in detail, and I thought it was very worthwhile quoting, the price of powerlessness. That the US administration has been so weak, it's just like pushing against an open door. And Russia's just walking in. When God moves a nation to occupy the spots in Ezekiel 38 and Daniel 8 and Daniel 11, the door's open. And he moves in there. In a gratuitous flaunting of its newly expanded reach, Russia will be conducting joint naval exercises with China in the South China Sea in obvious support of Beijing's territorial claims and illegal military bases. Now, we've often wondered how China actually fits into this arrangement. Well, China's not really mentioned in the scriptures. But what is interesting is that as time is progressing, it's becoming obvious that China is aligning itself with Russia. China's quite anti-American. Russia and China share similar views about the West. Beijing has territorial and illegal claims, so Russia and China fit together like hand in glove. Yet the president shows little concern. He's too smart not to understand geopolitics. He simply doesn't care. In part because his priorities are domestic. This is Obama was talking about. In part because he thinks we lack clean hands and thus the moral standing to continue to play the international arbiter. He has given up on the international scene. He is no longer the international policeman. He's no longer the international arbiter. He just is no longer interested. And Russia's taken advantage. And in part because he's convinced that in the long run it doesn't matter. Fluctuations in great power relations are inherently ephemeral. For a man who sees a moral arc in the universe bending inexorably toward justice, calculations of raw realpolitik are 20th century thinking. Primitive, obsolete, the obsessions of small minds. This is Obama's view of Russia. In an enlightened world that we exist, this primitive, obsolete kind of behaviour, it'll soon disappear. It will not soon disappear. Obama made all this perfectly clear in speeches at the UN in Cairo and here at home in his very first year of office. 2 terms later, we see the result. Ukraine dismembered. Eastern Europe on edge. Syria a charnel house. Iran subsuming Iraq. Russia and Iran on the march across the entire northern Middle East. That is a phenomenal closing paragraph. Phenomenal. Because precisely what the scriptures are saying is going to happen. Russia and Iran on the march across the entire northern Middle East. Northern Middle East, this is the King of the North Territory. Brothers and sisters, conclude our remarks this evening. We're going to understand that Brexit is an astounding sign. Saudi Arabia, Sheba and Dedan, talking with Israel, an astounding sign. Russia in the King of the North Territory, developing with Iran, an astounding sign. The question is, it's easy to watch and be excited by that, but what about the keeping of the garments? As you may be or may not be aware, that figure of speech is based on the practice of the temple guard. That in Herod's temple, when they closed the gates at night, they had Levitic guards surrounded, and they were given these special white uniforms, if you like, and they were told to keep awake. The high priest or one of his delegates would make these ad hoc inspections, and if he found you asleep, the next morning you were publicly arraigned before the rest of the group, your garments were stripped, and your shame and embarrassment was obvious before all. We don't want to be like that in front of Jesus Christ. Shame and the gnashing of teeth because we fell asleep. Awful sense of rejection because we couldn't keep our garments pure. But it's this last quotation that I really want to draw our attention in conclusion, because like Revelation 16, Luke 21 is addressed to us as the final generation before our Lord returns. And it is full of sober warnings because it's so absolutely needed for us. Take heed to yourself. Now there's someone probably sitting next side to you or in front of you or behind you. That's not what Jesus said. He said, take heed to yourself. Personal responsibility. Lest at any time, I find those words frightening. In the last 30 years of the Brotherhood's history, we have been swamped by ideas like sisters speaking from the platform, by theistic evolution. And each one of these waves just comes out of the blue, out of nowhere, and tragically, even though we try and withstand those kind of influences, it takes brothers and sisters away. And we lose people from time to time. At any time. Who knows what the next wave is going to be? But every wave that comes and challenges our statement of faith and challenges our ecclesia and challenges our very sensitivity to the truth takes people away at any time. That's frightening. Lest at any time your hearts, so you see, it's an attitudinal issue. World out there with its philosophies is attacking our subconscious, our consciousness, our priorities, our thoughts, our approach to life. It's the heart that's being attacked, our mind. And the attack is what's called an overcharging, a superfluousness of surfeiting and drunkenness and cares of this life. Isn't that our world? Bury your head in the sand kind of approach. This need for something to dull the reality of our world, the intoxicants, the pleasures, all this to just try and get through the tediousness of life and the evil of life. The Lord said, take heed to yourself. This is an exhortation for us, our generation, here now. That day come upon you unawares. Now we are excited today by the events happening. In fact, every week something dramatic happens. But is it having an effect? Are we different people for that? And I exhort myself in relation to that as well. Am I a better servant of Christ? Have I applied myself more to the things of God than I should be? You see, that's what these signs are all about. Watching is the easy part. It's the keeping the garments that's difficult. Watch ye therefore, and here's the antidote. Watch and pray. Be alert, not just to the signs of the times and the exciting things that happen, but be alert to the dangers. Waves of the isms that are coming, the false teachings, the attack on our statement of faith. All of these things are being undermined. Be aware of those things and pray always. And it's not an age of prayer. It's ridiculous life, the hectic pace that we live. Not an age encouraging prayer. We're going to change that. We've got to make time for prayer. This closeness of relationship with God is significant. Do you feel close to Jesus Christ? Do we know him? See, those are the questions we need to ask. And prayer is the means by which we draw close to God. Are we doing that? We may be accounted worthy to escape all these things. None of us are worthy, but we can be accounted worthy. None of us are righteous, but we can be accounted righteous. Well, that's our prayer, brothers and sisters, that the things that we've been discussing today will have an impact, will make a difference. That tomorrow morning, as we partake of the emblems, we're going to have a resolve to better brothers and sisters in Christ. Take heed of the things of our responsibilities more significantly. To attend to the word and to service, to dedication. Tomorrow's a new day. And these things have to affect us in the end. All want to stand accounted worthy before the Son of Man. None of us want to be ashamed, rejected, refused. None of us want that, but are we prepared to make the changes? Watch ye therefore and pray always that you may be accounted worthy to stand before the Son of Man.